it work? Yes. So good morning and a very warm welcome to our discussion today on trade. We are delighted to host and welcome today Cecilia Malmström, our Commissioner for Trade, who has been leading a lot of difficult discussions in the last 5 years. And so we want to discuss a bit the past, but of course focus on the present and focus on the future in particular, because there's a lot one can say nowadays about European and global trade policy. We are stuck, of course, in a very, very complicated trade war between China and the United States. We ourselves have some issues with the United States, and we have some issues with China. And let me use that occasion also to advertise a paper that our senior fellow, who will lead the conversation, André Sapir, is putting out today, a paper on how the WTO could and should be reformed to better accommodate China in the global trading system. So lots to talk about. This goes from the trade conflict, but it goes even to issues like climate policy. And we just had a little bit of a chat on climate policy. I mean, if the next Commission was to be much more serious imposing carbon tariffs, a carbon tax on consumption and production in Europe, well, there is immediately an issue of carbon border adjustment. And so how can that be made compatible with the global trading norms is also a big issue, I think, that the next Commission will have to confront. So without much further ado, let me give the floor to André and Cecilia, and thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure I'll jump in at some stage as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Commissioner, for being here, for taking the time. Let me start not with China and the United States. We'll have plenty of time to come to that. Let me start with the trading system. You have been, throughout your term, an impassioned voice for the global trading system, for a rules-based system, for a rules-based liberal trading system. How do you see the system right now, with all the events that have taken place at this very juncture? What is your assessment about the system? Is it going to survive this year, do you think? It's under stress, clearly. What is your judgment?
Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. Now it works.
Well, just continue. I think they need to.
Yeah, don't want to break your ears. Of course, the multilateral system is under enormous threat, probably the biggest threat so far since its creation. And the United States and Europe, some other countries, created this system after the World War, Second World War. It was part of this new global liberal order, if you want to call it a global order, institution-based multilateralism, international organizations trying to make sure that that was part of the new world we wanted to build after these devastating wars. And today, of course, it is under threat in many ways. And it didn't happen yesterday. Of course, this has been evolving because WTO, with all its, it's a fantastic organization with 164 countries member, but it is difficult to make decisions, of course. So that has paralyzed the system for quite some time, and has created a lot of inertia and frustration, of course. And now with increased unilateral action, with increased protectionism, with the increased actions outside the system, it is really trembling, I would say, on many levels. First of all, we have the general decision-making system. It's been difficult to move from the old Doha process, where we gave a lot of hope to the developing world, and we haven't really delivered on that. And it's not really one person, one country's fault. It is complicated, these issues. So this, of course, needs to break that deadlock on on development. How do you define yourself as a developing country? Today, 2/3 of the membership defines themselves as developing countries and thereby excludes themselves from certain of the obligations in WTO. And that cannot continue. Some of the richest countries in the world define themselves as developing countries. And that has to change. We need to focus on the least developed countries there as well.
But you think, just to make a parenthesis here, you think there should be some kind of criteria?
Well, yes, but that is different.
Some objective criterion, you think?
Well, this is being discussed now. But yes, I think somehow we need to come to that discussion, but they cannot be imposed from the EU or from the US. It has to be a growing discussion with the developing countries themselves to see what can be the mechanisms to graduate. Yeah. And that has started. Our Norwegian friends have started a discussion on that. And I think it would take time, but at least it's a conversation that has started. So that is for the old issues. Then we need to reform the way we are every day working. And there we made some proposals on transparency, on notification, on the daily work of the committees, how that can be reinforced and more efficient. And then there are only new issues. And there, on the one hand, we have made some progress by launching negotiations on e-commerce in January with almost 80 countries. Digital trade, of course, is the future. But on the other hand, there are, as you write in your paper that we just advertised for, and I really recommend for those of you WTO nerds like us, the gradual incapacity of WTO and the former GATT system to deal with, for instance, a country with a state capitalism like China, with massive industrial subsidies, with forced technology transfer, where there aren't any rules, and where China can do that, and the rest of us can be very frustrated, but we don't really have the tools to address it multilaterally. And that is why the US are doing what they do. We share their concern about the problem, but we don't share their methods. So we are engaging with the US and Japan to try to see, can we write new rules within the multilateral system? That's work ongoing, and it's quite positive. But that needs to be addressed, of course, because it doesn't create a level playing field. And then finally, the most urgent thing is the appellate body, where the US has been blocking the appointment of the arbitrators. And if nothing happens, the 12th of December, the system will die. I think that is quite likely, unfortunately. We have been working to put proposals to listen to some of the American concerns. Of course, it's a system that works basically well, but it can always improve. We have made some proposals with other countries. Other countries have made proposals, but so far the US is not engaging in that.
Are those proposals, I know the proposals, but are those proposals, just for the audience, are they about the way the system works, or are they also about the substance, right? Because we know from the US, it's not just about the way judges are being really appointed or reappointed, right? There is some complaint about some of the judgments.
Yes. First of all, there's the way that the judges are appointed, how long they stay, how long the procedures take. And of course, it takes a lot of time, but it's increasingly complex, the demands as well. Here, maybe we can do some improvements, but they also have some complaints about what they call overreach, that the court is sort of going too far than the actual cases. But the fact is that since the creation of this in '95, the US has been winning 86% of all the cases. So, it's been rather favorable for them as well. But so far, it hasn't, they have not really engaged in that discussion that is ongoing in Geneva. So if nothing happens, that system will collapse. And that would be...
Their complaint is usually about the anti-dumping, right?
Yes,
this is where they have... they feel, what is the EU position on that, on the substance? Is the EU willing to talk about those matters, or things that no? We only talk about the formal issues.
Our position has been that in general, we think the system works. So if it ain't broken, you don't need to fix it. You can marginally improve the procedures, and you can discuss that, but we need an independent two-level system, and it has worked rather well. There are other proposals made by countries like Australia and Japan who goes a little bit further than the EU position. But we're willing to discuss everything, but let's first unblock the blocking and then make sure that the system works, and then we can see what possible improvements need to do on that. But we haven't really, they are criticizing the system, but they have not really, come with proposals on how to make it better. So it's difficult to negotiate with yourself.
So let's say, as you said, on central scenario, on December 12th, the system is blocked, right? What's next? What are you telling your successor? about that. What should the EU do? Should the EU take the lead of like-minded countries to say, well, there are possibilities in the system to create, right, to operate. Is one willing to do that without the US, to say, well, the US for the moment stays on the side and we continue? What is the EU, or what should be, in your view, the EU position on this?
Well, we have, as the EU, been trying to take the lead in proposing these reforms and engaging with the whole membership to reform. We will continue. It's discussions in WTO in Geneva, led by the New Zealand ambassador called Ambassador Walker. So we call it the Walker process, and we will continue to engage in that and until the 11th at midnight, of course. But we, of course, need to start thinking, what if it really collapses? Because EU is one of the biggest clients of the system. We have lots of interests, and our companies, our member countries are questioning what will happen, how can we be protected? So there's not an evident, it's not a plan B, that if that doesn't work, we do this. You could, of course, create a total parallel system. There are provisions to do that with all the other countries. But in order to do that, you would need to make sure that you have enough countries who really want to engage. And I think it's a little bit premature to presume that for the moment. We have been discussing whether you could set up within the system some sort of bilateral conflict resolution between those who want to, based on the current statute of WTO, and working with the Secretariat as an interim solution, so that we have this with the partners we have FTAs with. But it's not, we are thinking about exactly how to draft this. We've started that discussion within our member states, of course, but also with other countries.
Okay, I think maybe we can open the discussion about the United States. Since the US administration, the current administration, actually following from already the previous administration, the Obama administration, started the discussion about the appellate body, but certainly with the Trump administration, things have taken a turn that was not expected, certainly coming from the United States. You said, European countries and the United States were the founders of the system, so one did not expect the US to take the position that it has, although one knew for a while that the US was unhappy about a number of developments.
It didn't come with President Trump.
It's not new.
No.
I think what has been new is the manner, maybe, and the force with which the US is trying to push a change, maybe in the system. Now, in your view, is this all about China? What was a bit puzzling last year, 2 years ago, when the steel issue came about. It was first about steel, national security. We are still waiting now for the automobile. We have a few months, but it's a very short respite. But then very quickly after the steel and aluminum came the China, which is the much bigger affair. Now, what is your assessment as to why did the United States, one could have understood, perhaps, one logic, that the US said, China has been a member of the WTO for a while. We had some expectation about the way China was going to evolve. There is friction. China has become the largest exporter. There's also, obviously, strategic rivalry between China and the US, the technology, all of those things. The 301 case, one can sort of understand where they are coming from. One doesn't have to share, but one can at least understand. But just before they did that, they launched the steel. Now one can say, well, we know people in the US administration, the steel background, USTR, all of those, maybe, election. But, why divide countries? Why take on Europe and some of the US allies at that time? So what is the assessment from the EU viewpoint? Not just from the Commission, but, what is the assessment as to what is the US up to?
Well, I wish I fully understood that, actually, because as you say, the frustration that the US feels vis-à-vis China and the massive overproduction of steel, aluminium, and a few other products in China due to state-owned companies, to subsidies that are not allowed in Europe and many other countries, is, of course, creating a global market that is unfair. And that affects us as well. We have lots of cases on steel going on against China and others in the WTO, actually. So I understand that frustration. But the notion, and I also understand the American politics of wanting to make US much more independent, breaking the international value chains and focus on America first. That was his program. That is fair. That's what he won on. But in that politics, to say that the European allies, and almost all of our countries are NATO members, we built this world together, that we are a strategic, that we are a national security threat because of our steel export or car exports, that is totally unacceptable, of course, because we are allies, we are friends, we could work together on China, and in certain areas we do. So this, of course, has offended many member states, as it has with Korea, Japan, and Mexico, and Canada, and others as well. And we totally reject those tariffs. We will not engage in managed trade, and we have taken, as so has 11 other countries, that action on steel tariffs to the WTO, because we think that this is a safeguard in disguise, and that it is illegal according to WTO. So the methods we don't agree with, but the frustration we can understand, and I mean the policy of focusing on America, that is his electoral platform. He won on that. You could agree or disagree, but that's domestic politics. But it's very unfortunate that friends and allies, like the strong transatlantic partnership, is being rejected like this.
What was also surprising was the instrument that was used by the US to protect the steel.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So because after all,
Cold War.
that's right.
Yeah.
George Bush also had George W. Bush also had steel tariff at midterm. I remember when President Trump introduced the tariff in the spring. I thought, well, this is exactly like what Bush had done, right?
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
Exactly, but it was about using a totally different instrument. So is there, I mean, if you put this together with the appellate body, I'm putting tough questions on you. Do you think that, I mean, one possible explanation, a very unpleasant explanation, is the US wanting to undermine the system altogether? It's not just undermining this and that. You put appellate body, you put using national security, knowing that it would put the WTO in a very, very complicated situation. Allies, I mean, all of this together, is it a break from the US policy since World War II? Since Roosevelt, since the creation of all this system? Is that really a break? Because the US would have made the assessment that, after all, the system that it helped to create and that was useful in a sense also for the US. The US underwrote the system, but the US felt that that system is also beneficial to it. Well, maybe the system it feels now is no more beneficial, and we need to have something totally different. Is that the risk? That, I mean, the start of our conversation is that the WTO is really at risk, not just because of the appellate body, but because the US doesn't feel it has value anymore.
Well, it's not totally clear, but it is obvious that the multilateral system, international order, and many other international organizations is not seen by this administration as something valuable. I mean, they have withdrawn from several international treaties, they're criticizing others, and so on, that the multilateral system is sort of perceived as a threat to American sovereignty. I mean, they've always been skeptical to international courts and so on, but this is taking it one step further. If that is the calculated strategy, then it's extremely worrying, but it's certainly going in that direction.
Now, let's talk a little bit about China, and then we
Another easy question.
That's right. And then we can talk about some of the future issues. I'm trying to keep this part half an hour, and then we can open up the discussion, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Now, China has really been, I think, a remarkable member, in the sense that through its membership since 2001, it's clear that it has grown tremendously.
Indeed.
And I think one should take credit for it, and the system can take credit. China should take credit. The system
lifted millions of people out of poverty.
Absolutely, it's certainly a remarkable, from world event.
Absolutely.
This is really something very, very important. Now that China is where it is, I think probably one wants China to assume more responsibility. Yeah. And that would be good. China assumes more responsibility. China, I think, values the system, made declaration. You think there is, when you look at the US, China, and the EU, we are by far, the three blocks, we are by far the biggest blocks. And then come others, and there are other important players, obviously. There's Brazil, there are India, there's Japan, Canada. There are many other players, but there are really three big ones, and then others. Do you think it would be at all possible to have quietly, not necessarily, through Twitter, and to come to the view that, okay, we value the system, but okay, we are 21st century, the world has changed. There's not only e-technology, there's other things. There's China that has become a member. There's many elements that have occurred since the rules, the GATT, then the WTO. We need to upgrade. But if one were to be able to come with a package, you think that there is a possibility, there is a little window there. The EU, which is not in direct confrontation, neither with the US, it has skirmishes, I would say. We are not in a trade war with the US. We are not in a trade war with China, right? So it's not like the US and China that are really at loggerhead. So do you think there is some possibility that the EU, together with other countries that you mentioned, Japan, Canada, sort of like-minded countries that value the system, is there room for? Again, I'm trying to think also not just the situation now, but looking forward.
Well,
is there a path?
Well, I wish, because this would be the logical thing to do, of course. Despite our differences and the fundamental disagreements on some of these issues, to sit together informally and to see what we can do. Because, as you said, China has benefited enormously from the multilateral system. And I do really believe that they want to preserve it and that they are willing to work hard to preserve it, but also reform it. But we wish that they could take a more leading role and to show that they listen to some of the concerns of the others and to take their responsibility. But of course, you cannot ask China, even if you don't agree with the system in China, you cannot ask China to, over a few months, because of the tariff threat, reform their whole political system. It will not happen. So you have to work in a different way. And ideally, we would sit together and define the problems and see what can be done. That is not happening today. And I don't see it on the short term, maybe a little bit longer. We have been making that offer to the USA, that let's work together on China. There are several areas we could work, and then we need to engage with them as well, and to make them take some necessary steps. What we are doing, as I said, is in this ministerial cooperation with US and Japan, where we have met, and the EU, where we have met now 6 times, where we're trying to draft new rules. At one point, when we see that they start to become more defined and more clear, to engage with China and others as well. See, is this something we can work on? We're not really there yet, because it's legally very complicated to make those things, but maybe by the end of the summer or autumn, we could start getting there. In the meantime, of course, we are working with many other countries. You mentioned, Japan, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Australia, and Canada and others to see what can be done. But that sort of trilateral sitting, no. That used to be the case in history, but so far there is not. And also, it's not really the EU's role to mediate between the EU and China. We are not a mediator. We have our relations with the US, we have relations with China, we have difficulties, we have cooperations, we have criticism, we have forums where we cooperate, and of course we pass this message to China as well in summits and in different bilateral contacts. And we try to pass some messages, but we're not a cushion between those countries. We need to stand up for the multilateral system at any force, because if the EU don't do it, then we're really badly off.
So while standing up for the multilateral system and
die with your boots on.
carrying the torch, and that's important to do that. At the same time, you and the EU have been pursuing also a bilateral agenda. We have bilateral discussion with China on investment. Now there is a new process with the US. We'll discuss that. And then there have been the different agreements that have been signed. Japan, Canada. I mean, it was sometimes a difficult process, but you brought it forward with success.
And democracy didn't end.
That's right.
Still here, yes.
That's right. So I think certainly, the view that some people had that when we had a difficulty with Canada, it was the end of the possibility. I remember headlines in newspapers, right, that it showed that it was, the EU incapable of negotiating and bringing to a conclusion agreement. That was
and now it has proven to be actually efficient. Trade has increased between us. Lots of countries are really feeling the concrete benefits of that, also for the small and medium-sized companies. We have opened up totally new possibilities to engage with a very like-minded country such as Canada, and we're already seeing positive trends. It's still very early days, but positive trends with Japan on increased trade, especially in the agricultural sector and wine sector from the European Union.
That was certainly.
So trade works. Yeah.
That was clearly a success, and with a like-minded country.
It's also like-minded. This is also we've discovered with Japan. Japan is a culture that is not as known to us like Canada, for instance. But working with the Japanese, we have discovered that on everything from data protection to environmental research, we are actually very like-minded.
Yeah. So what about the US discussions, the new discussions with the US? What is your assessment about where we are headed?
Well, they are, it is a variety of items we discuss with them, many based on the statement made by after the meeting almost a year ago now by President Juncker and President Trump in the White House, where we sort of tried to agree on a positive agenda, because that was a quite rough rhetorically moment. So we are working on this Wto reforms, as I said, very constructively. And then we have I received mandates from the member states to start 2 negotiations, one on conformity assessment and one on a smaller agreement covering industrial goods. Those discussions have not started yet on industrial goods. We are ready, but we haven't started them yet. We have, however, started the technical discussions on conformity assessment and on regulatory cooperation. Where can we, with respect of our different systems, facilitate some of the approval, some of the certification, some of the facilitation to have where we have similar systems on our
Is that picking up from TTIP?
Some of the things we could use from TTIP, yes. But then, of course, things change so rapidly. But there are some low-hanging fruits that I think we have made some progress. And we are discussing, medical devices and pharmaceutical, some cyber issues, and the conformity assessment, where we started to explore what can we do. So there is a discussion, both on political level. We met last time with Ambassador Lighthizer, the USTR, in Paris 2 weeks ago, and our collaborators meet regularly all the time. So there is progress. It's technical, and there's not like tomorrow we will present one big package, but it's a process which will, if we succeed, could actually be beneficial for our companies on both sides of the Atlantic, and that would be a good thing, because US and EU we trade every second. We trade with each other, but it could still be easier and cheaper. And us not having a trade agreement with each other is, of course, stupid. For the moment, there is no prospect of having a big trade agreement, but this could be a smaller one to build confidence again, and then who knows for the future.
What about China? The recent summit, EU-China summit, reaffirmed the objective to have an investment agreement by 2020.
Yes, that's next year.
You think we are making? I mean, it's been also
It's been a very long process.
It's been a long process. Are we making progress, you would say?
Well, it's been a long process where we made initially some progress, and then it didn't move much. Now it has started to move a little. But still, we hope that China would be a bit more generous in their offers. But we have regular contacts. Our negotiators talk basically every month and so on. So we hope that we will certainly do our part to stand by that commitment to finalize next year. And I hope that the Chinese will as well, because that would be a platform where we could, it's not a trade agreement, it's an investment agreement to level the playing field a little bit. But we discuss all kinds of issues there, and that would certainly send an important signal to the world and to each other that we are ready to engage here. It's an important partner, a complicated partner, of course. As you said, also a rival, a systemic rival. But we have also many areas where we could cooperate, and where this would be, I mean, this is the EU method. You talk, you compromise, you try to find ways forward.
A last question from me about the future agenda. The EU has proclaimed seriousness about climate.
Yes.
Maybe more proclamation than actual action.
It's
but
what you
still,
compare to, yeah.
Right?
EU is still one of the leading globally.
One of the leading.
Yeah.
That's right.
It wouldn't be a Paris Agreement without EU.
Yes, you're right about that. But clearly, on the path that we are now, we are not going to reach the objective. So if we were to reach the goals that we proclaim to believe in from Paris, we would need to up our game. Right?
Absolutely.
To up our game. And that may mean to have, carbon tax. No, then would come a trade discussion. Clearly, there would be voices in the EU to say, well, if we are doing this very seriously, putting a carbon tax at a sufficiently high level to have a bite, then there would be the issue about a carbon tax adjustment. What is your view about that? Is that something that should be pursued? That's something that from the trade side people would say, no, don't mess with that. What is your personal view on this?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that the next Commission and the Parliament and Council and so on, this will be one of the biggest priority, climate change, in all areas, not only in trade. And we need absolutely to level up our ambitions by far. In trade issue, I think the discussion needs to start in that order, not the other way around as it is today, because I personally think that a carbon tax is a good idea. That is not the view of the Commission. I mean, the Commission has not formulated, but that is my view, and I think we need to go that way, and it can perfectly be combined with growth as well. It has in my country worked for 30 years, and I think absolutely, and OECD and many research report confirms that this is the most important thing you can do for climate. If you do that in Europe, then naturally there will be a discussion of what you do with the border, and but only then. You cannot first say what you do at the border if we haven't sorted our own house. And I think, but then of course you need to look at that with the legal experts. If you do some sort of border adjustment tax that is non-discriminatory and transparent based on what we have, that is possible according to WTO. But you need to look at the details. And that is a discussion that will follow, which is natural, but you need to get it right. And because we also need to make sure we have for quite some time included ambitious sustainable development chapters in our bilateral trade agreements. And we will continue to do so. And as depending on the partners, there will be more and more ambitious. But we also need to look at what can we do on the multilateral level. And this is sensitive, you know that, in WTO, because you will immediately hear screams of protectionism and so on. So you need to get that right, but we need to start that conversation. What can we do? And this is what our citizens are expecting from us. And trade cannot solve all these problems, but it can play its part. And so there will need to be a discussion, how can we green trade? Or make it more greener. Unfortunately, we had very good discussions a few years ago on a plurilateral initiative called Environmental Goods Agreement, where we were trying to take away tariffs on environmental friendly goods techniques. So we had a list of hundreds of proposals. And China was in, and US was in, and we were in, and some of the biggest economies. Unfortunately, that is on ice right now. And we must see, is there any way we could start those discussions again, because that would be a good thing. We have that in our bilaterals. We are trying to give priority to green technique, but we need to have that on the bilateral. And this will be a huge challenge, but that comes in all the fields. I mean, in transport, infrastructure, research, foreign policy,
goods
what have you.
Services.
Goods and services as well, but also in other fields that are outside trade, because, I mean, we have citizens marching every Friday now who ask us to take more action. And we must, and not only because the school children are demonstrating, which I think is very encouraging that they engage, but also because we have solid research showing that if we don't do it, I was going to say a bad word, but I'm not. But when we have a problem, yeah. I know no mummy's maybe watching.
Well, I have to say on the last point, I very much concur with what you said. And, I've just reviewed a bit the literature on climate change. I mean, there's increasing evidence that warming is happening faster than predicted and than we thought a few years ago. And if we are not getting serious now, we will be too late for sure. We might already be too late at this stage. So I have a lot of sympathy for you and also for the young people, actually, that are marching at this stage.
And the young people. I'm not that old.
You're not a high school student anymore, so let me go back to the question on and I listened very carefully to the conversation U.S. China and quiz you a bit more on China because the U.S. is going into an outright trade war, which is dramatic, and which is actually not just based on one person, the man in the White House. It's based on a pretty far-reaching consensus in U.S. society. It's a bipartisan consensus that China's practices are unfair and that China is a geostrategic rival. Now, if I look at the European conversation on China, it's still different. And I want to quiz you a little bit on where you see really our assessment and our view on China. I mean, there is the side on unfair practices. You mentioned the steel. Sure, the steel is an issue. How big the issue is, one can debate in terms of the overall impact on the economy. Then there is state-owned enterprise, there's subsidization, there is the issue of lack of market access. But, is it really a system rival? I mean, would you consider it a systemic geostrategic rival that would justify the kind of action that the US is actually currently taking, which is a full right trade war? I mean, we are not doing that. And I think we are doing that, not that, for a variety of reasons. And I would like to hear from you a little bit how strongly do you think the Chinese economic model is really a problem for the European economy?
Well, economic and political model, I would say. And I agree with you that the US strategy has a lot of support in the US, in Congress, for instance, and so on. Even though we hear every day, and some contact us directly, complaints from American companies who are now affected by the tariffs because the method is wrong. Their analysis could be right, but the method is wrong because it affects ordinary people. If nothing happens in a year, we'll have a huge deficit of medicines. I mean, it will really affect ordinary people in their daily life. And many companies are now finding it hard and very expensive to get what they need in their production. So in the European Union, well, we don't use methods like that. We try to flatter ourselves saying that our method need to be within the multilateral system, because if it fails and we are undermining it, I mean, it becomes our biggest, we become our own enemy. But we have sharpened our instruments as well. We have been both in bilaterally official and unofficial talks. We have been quite clear on what we think. We have sharpened our trade defense instruments, not only on steel, but on a lot of others, not only because of China, but there are other there as well, but our trade defense instruments on anti-dumping tools are now in a better shape than they were before. They're quicker, they're more efficient, they're more transparent. We publish a report on China, also including a chapter on sustainable development and labor. rights, for instance. We have this investment screening mechanism now in place, which is also not a China mechanism. There are other countries who could be affected as well. And it starts working. Member states have had their coordination meetings and so on. And we are working on this international procurement instrument. It's been on the agenda for quite some time, but now discussions have resumed again after the European Council conclusions in March. So, you know, we have those tools as well. At the same time, if we want to address climate change, we need to work with China.
Of course.
There I think we have joint interests, and there are other areas where we can work together. So it's it is a rival, but it can also be a partner. And the methods are different, but as I said, many of the analysis of the US we share, but we don't think these methods, first of all, they're not legal, and secondly, they're not efficient.
Right. We are also in dialogue with China and have recently had China coming here and issuing a joint statement with the European Union where we agreed together to work on some issues such as WTO reform, but also opening of China, more reciprocity, which is not, the term is not strictly in the paper, but President Tusk and President Juncker both mentioned it very strongly in the press conference afterwards. So let's see how strong the commitment there is. But at least there is a discussion on WTO reform, and there seems to be some support from China to go in that direction. How far will we get with China on WTO reform?
But it's impossible to say. But as I said to André, we have. I fundamentally believe that China has benefited from the WTO membership, and that if WTO sort of collapses, they would lose a lot. And they understand this. And we have this working group. We met 2 or 3 times on reform of WTO, starting to map what could possibly be done. It will not be easy. And we are calling upon China to take a great leadership there when it comes to doing their part, but also we're willing to listen to some of their concerns. I mean, the Chinese economy is also, you know, it's not growing as fast as it should, and that they have some problems there as well. So also for domestic reasons, they need to engage and to do some reforms, and maybe this can be a part of it. But it will take time. And I don't foresee any date soon where we can declare a big agreement on this, but we keep on discussing, and others do as well. So, and that's the only. I mean, I don't see any other way to do than talk, come with proposal, engage, sit down, push, and also have a few tougher tools at our disposal to say that we welcome Chinese investment. Well, absolutely, we don't want to close Europe for Chinese investment, but there could be some screening if they are targeting some critical infrastructure, and they will, because that is explicit in their China 2020 strategy, that they are focusing on that, and that could then be subject to screening, and then member states could take action to stop it.
Well, I do want to bring in the audience also with some questions and remarks. So please do raise your hands, and I'll try to pick a few. So the gentleman all the way in the back, I think, was the first I saw. Well, I mean, I have to be selective. Please, and please identify yourself. Please just speak. Yes.
Good morning. Dimitri Anikel, Policy Advisor on Access to Medicine from Médecins Sans Frontières. Thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you, Madam Malmström, for sharing your views. Last week it was reported in the South American press that the EU-Mercosur trade agreement is near conclusion, and that it includes a provision that will limit the compulsory licensing in the first 5 years after market approval of a medicine. Now, at the same time, we see that in the UK Health Secretary is looking at the option of compulsory licensing to get access to Orkambi for rare diseases. And also the Dutch government is looking at exploring the option of compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing is a public health safeguard enshrined in the patent system to ensure access to medicine.
But please come to the question.
Yeah. So my question is, isn't this reality that wants to be including limitations on compulsory licensing or TRIPS flexibilities in the IP chapter, while at the same time the access to medicines challenges are also a problem in Europe, and European governments are looking at this option?
Okay, thank you. We collect a few,
okay,
if you don't mind. So the young lady here.
Hi, Stacey Featherstone here on behalf of the European Sugar Refineries Association. I also, my question also ties into Mercosur. I just wondered when you thought agricultural market access offers might be exchanged. As you know, for sugar refiners, it's a bit of an existential question to have a duty-free TRQ on sugar. I just wondered what the timeline was on that.
Thank you very much. And then there's a question here by the gentleman here. Please use the mic because we need your live stream.
Hans van der Burchert with Politica. I'm afraid my question is also on Mercosur. Let me phrase it a bit different. After basically spending a year or so saying that the South Americans need to deliver more and the ball is in their court on various issues like auto tariffs, etc. Now the ball seems to have come very quickly back in our court with Brazil making lots of concessions. And while I understand you have become careful in making projections when Mercosur can be finished, do you think we are ready now to make also concessions on our part and deliver this agreement, knowing that the window of potential conclusion is about to close? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. We have perhaps this is one block of questions on
block
Mercosur.
Yes.
Do you want to quickly
I can take
that?
them.
And then, no question on Mercosur after that.
No, I think I'll say what I can say on this. On the question of medicine and IPR, this is one of the issues that we're not finalized yet. So we are still negotiating. On Mercosur is a long saga, of course, and I will definitely not say that on that date we will be done. But we are getting closer. We've seen a lot of engagement during the spring. We have exchanged some offers, of course, in agriculture already, the more non-controversial. So agriculture is an important part of every trade agreement, and especially in this one. So there has been exchanges. The very final exchanges and the quotas where there will be no liberalization but TRQs. You mentioned one area, there are others that are sensitive. Of course, the final decisions there will be made at the very last moment before we say, okay. So the timeline is the very last day, probably, as always. In a trade agreement, you give and take. So is Europe ready to make concessions? Of course. Otherwise, you cannot, that's the point of negotiating. We will make concessions, and we expect them to make concessions. That's the point. So yes, we will. We are engaging with them. We had our people talk to each other just in May. We made lots of progress there as well. There are some complicated matters remaining, IPR, agriculture, and a few others. We keep on talking. I think there is a window now to close this during this commission. I will absolutely do my utmost to do it. This is priority number one right now, to close this. I think we are starting to get ready. This is an agreement between the EU and 4 countries, 230 million people. Only in tariffs, it would be worth more than Japan, 4 times more than Japan and Canada together, only tariffs. And then we have public procurement, you have services, you have all the others. And showing to the world right now about what we talked about, that EU and that part of Latin America, with whom we have long historical ties, are ready to do a trade agreement would be an extremely powerful signal, of course. And also, if the WTO were collapsing, I mean, there is a value in itself for all of us to have rules within where you can operate. So for both economic reasons, strategic reasons, cultural reasons, and political reasons, everything speaks in favor of this. I'm not saying this is going to be easy, because in the end, there's always very difficult choices to make and difficult final estimations. And yes, the sugar sector and a few others keep calling me, maybe not on an hourly basis, but daily. So I am very aware, as is my friend and colleague Phil Hogan, on the red lines perceived from Europe. So we have them close. You can trust on that. But I think this is absolutely worth doing. It would be a fantastic opportunity and a huge miss if we close the window now. Will we do it? I hope so, but I'm not sure yet, because we're not done yet. But I will definitely dedicate as much as my awake time as I can when I'm not dealing with the rest of the little details we talked about.
Great, thank you. So indeed, bilateral trade agreements also as an insurance policy against the breakup of the WTO. Indeed, I think it's a very important point. Yes. And you've been tremendously successful in your term with the EU-Japan agreement, which is, of course, a major insurance because we cover 1/3 of the global GDP. But let me take a few more questions. Maria de Mertzes, Bruegel's Deputy Director, then Fraser Cameron. and the gentleman here was.
Thank you. If I may pick up on the question that... is it on?
Yes.
It's not really on, but please just speak in the mic, yes.
Yeah, on the question that Guntram finished with on the WTO, and I want to ask the question, which WTO and which multilateral system should we preserve? And could it be that what the US is doing, part of the action that the US is currently doing, that, as you said, we don't really understand, is really a realization that the world is changing with a very big new player coming in that is not going to settle for being just a rule taker, but is want to be a rule maker at some point, and therefore the current multilateral system isn't going to look like the same in 10 years from now. So therefore what they're doing right now is just carving space, and something that the US has understood, but actually the EU has not understood, is exactly this point, and therefore the multilateral system we're trying to preserve is not the current one, but some future one, and what is that going to be?
Okay.
How many hours do we have for that?
But it's a good one. So let's take a few.
Fraser Cameron from the EU Asia Centre. It's no secret that there are very different views amongst member states on trade. So it'd be interesting to get your assessment as to how the evolution of these views you have observed over the last few years, and any predictions you might make for the future, given Brexit, and what the balance of forces regarding free trade might be in the future EU.
Thank you. And then here, the gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Moritz Bruegel from the Critical Raw Material Alliance, and I would like to go back to China. China is a dominant producer of many raw materials that we need in Europe and also in the US to produce and to furnish our industries. It has already kind of threatened the US to bring that into the quotation of its disputes. What do you think Europe should be doing in the next 5 years to secure supply of raw materials and critical raw materials in particular?
Okay. Thank you. So raw materials and China, Brexit and member states, or EU after Brexit, are we still pro-trade? And the future of a new multilateral trading system.
No, but that is, of course, a very interesting question, yes. and it would need a lot of time to discuss. I'm happy to continue this discussion at some other time with you, because if you're right that they have understood, actually, and we got it wrong, then we need another strategy. And of course the WTO system is not perfect. Of course not. I mean, it was created at a totally different time, and things have evolved, and we are 164 members and others knocking on the door as well. The question is, and I mentioned several areas where we need to reform, the question is, if you tear it down, can you build up something credible again, or will we have a big vacuum of nothing until something else maybe comes out? I'm not sure. So until I have proof of the opposite, I think reforming from inside is still the safest strategy. And I'm willing to, within that, find new pragmatic ways. But reforming from within seems to be the safest if we still want a multilateral system that has served us well and still serves us well. If it collapses totally, we will lose, the whole world will lose, and the most poorest countries will lose a lot, because it will be the total rule of the jungle with the strongest prevailing, and that's not a world we want to see.
So on this point, can you push a little bit more? So the US is not there at the table anymore at the appellate body. Do we construct an appellate body 2.0 without the US, and we agree among all the others?
That could potentially be a way, but then you need to make sure that you have all the others on board to do that. And I think many countries at this stage feel that that is too confrontational to do that, and to try to still push the system if at the very end to see if we can do it, and then maybe pursue this more bilateral sort of interim solutions until we find something. But there is provision in the DSU of WTO, and André can confirm that you could create a parallel system without the US. That could happen. But I think that decision is far too early to take. And I'm not
the bilateral system for sure would not include all the small countries, the developing countries that you mentioned.
No, that is true. But they are not clients of the system, but they sort of benefit of the outcomes.
Exactly.
And if you use the WTO Secretariat, if you use a pool of sort of retired arbitrators, you would make sure that there is continuity and the WTO spirit lives on. So we'd not take just anybody to mediate, because that would be a totally different system. But it's a good question. I'll have to think about that. In the member states, well, obviously, our British friends are true believers of free trade and have been very supportive on this. And when I started as Trade Commissioner, there was a difficult moment, especially because of TTIP, but also CETA, demonstrations, and so on. And we had some tough discussions in the Council. But I would say that lately, the last 3 years or so, there's been very strong unanimity. Not on all the details, absolutely not. But on our trade agenda in general, on these policies that we're pursuing in WTO, we are totally united. On our bilateral, on the more trade defense instruments, there's been very strong support for that. That can vary, and let's see how the new parliament looks and when they start there. But for the moment, we've had, I feel a very strong support from member states.
And raw material and
the raw material, yes, that is also a very complicated issue because, of course, they have, and that shows the absurdity of trade wars because you start there and then it escalates and then you go to levels where really, really critical raw materials, medicines, and others become a deficit for large part of ordinary citizens, and that's why they are so bad. They are not good. They're not easy to win. What should the EU do if that happens? Well, first of all, we hope that we will not be part of that, but it's definitely something we have started to discuss. We don't have a strategy for that yet, but because it's only a threat, but this is something where we need to make sure that we can still have access to this and that we are not affected. And we hope that the trade war will not escalate to this level because it would be bad for everybody. But it's an important point.
André,
let me ask you, if I may, a follow-up question to Fraser's question. I mean, you asked about countries, but in your answer, I think you spoke not only about countries, you spoke also about the European Parliament. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very important dimension, since now Parliament has an important role since the Lisbon Treaty in trade policy, and after all, Japan, the Japan agreement was ratified by Parliament, right? It's EU
and
only,
Singapore, yeah.
And Singapore, and part of Singapore as well. So there are EU only agreements. Now, I mean, can you share with us your experience in working with Parliament that has been assuming, in the past? I remember when we were comparing the EU and the US, in the US, Congress usually played a very important role in trade policy, right? And it was, in our case, obviously we have, in a sense, the Senate, the member states, but Parliament was not a player. Now, Parliament has become a real player. And can you share a little bit with us? I mean, you have been involved. I mean, to get those agreements through, obviously you had to work also closely with Parliament. So can you share a bit with us what is your experience and what is it you would tell also your successor, given the composition of the new Parliament?
Well, the juiciest details of my relations with different MEPs you'll read about in my memoirs. But I can tell you that I think it's been a learning curve for all of us. Because now the INTA committee, the trade committee in the Parliament, is top 2 or top 3 when they choose chairmanship, because they realize this is one of the heaviest one. And they have learned also to grow into that role, to not only be critical or to have different views, which of course is part of it, but also take a responsibility, because they have that power right now. I hope that the new Parliament and the new INTA committee also will take that, to be critical but constructive and to engage a lot with the Commission. I have tried to be present very, very regularly in INTA committee as a whole, in the different reference groups and with different individuals a lot, and that is an advice I would like to give to my successor. Never underestimate the European Parliament. It's a good advice in general. And also continue, I think they have appreciated our transparency agenda that I've been really pushing for 5 years almost, that they have access, that they can follow, that they can be involved in a very transparent and inclusive way in the negotiation process. And then, of course, they will have to take a decision. They will have to weigh, is it better to engage and to push or to reject, which can be powerful political signal, but that closes the door for engagement with that country. And I don't know how it will be, so it's too early to say, but they need to take that responsive role and to engage with our different partners and also with us, and we will certainly continue. As soon as they are constituted, I'll reach out to them, of course. But they have been helpful because they have been pushing for these reforms that we have tried to do on transparency, on inclusiveness, on more value-based agenda, on a more efficient enforcement and implementation, which has been very helpful vis-à-vis member states and vis-à-vis others as well.
So I think on the whole, they've been more of an ally.
They've been a bit difficult, but that's their role. But they've been important allies as well, yes. And I think they have really grown into that. There are some really, really knowledgeable people in that committee who have played an important role.
Sure. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Commissioner. It was wonderful to hear from you at the end of this commission and to have your insights also on the way forward. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the Commissioner.